Dubai solved a problem that should have limited the city from the very beginning: freshwater. It built enormous machines capable of turning the surrounding seawater directly into drinking water. And those machines actually worked. They worked so well that the city could simply continue growing. But producing all that engineered water required an absolutely enormous industrial system. So Dubai began building a different kind of machine. And now that new machine is becoming enormous too. By 2025, peak daily desalinated water demand reached roughly 487 million imperial gallons. That is an astonishing volume of water to manufacture from the sea every single day. So what happens when the solution to water scarcity becomes something an entire city can no longer function normally without? How did Dubai solve its original freshwater limitation? If the old desalination system still works perfectly fine, why is the city changing how new water capacity is built? And why could a better water machine ultimately make engineered water even more important? A rapidly growing modern city requires far more freshwater than natural groundwater resources can conveniently support indefinitely. Historically, Dubai relied on local groundwater to survive. The sheer scale of the desert environment made it impossible to simply wait for rain. But as urban demand grew and the conservation of those natural underground aquifers became increasingly important, the city faced a hard physical limit. You cannot sustain millions of residents, massive cooling systems, and widespread commercial infrastructure without a reliable and highly scalable water source. Large-scale seawater desalination emerged as the definitive alternative. It was the only viable way to decouple the growth of the city from the natural limits of the local water table. The transition required heavy industrial engineering. Potable water production at the massive Jebel Ali Power and Desalination Complex officially began back in 1979. That marked the moment Dubai fundamentally changed its relationship with water. The question was no longer about how to find enough natural freshwater hidden in the ground. The question became entirely different. How do you build a huge city without a huge natural freshwater source? You have to look toward the sea. Dubai genuinely solved a major physical constraint. It engineered a highly successful way to make the sea drinkable. The primary technology that made modern Dubai possible relies on a process known as multi-stage flash distillation. The mental model for this old machine is actually quite straightforward. It relies heavily on heat. The system takes in raw seawater and applies intense thermal energy. That heated saltwater then passes through a series of heavy industrial chambers, or stages, each held at a progressively lower pressure. The sudden drop in atmospheric pressure causes a portion of the heated seawater to instantly flash into vapor. That pure water vapor is then captured, condensed, and treated to become fresh drinking water. This was not a failed experiment. It was not a temporary patch. This thermal machine worked extraordinarily well and allowed Dubai to expand into a major global hub. In fact, this original solution remains a massive piece of the current infrastructure. This industrial network runs 24 hours a day, continuously burning energy to heat the ocean. At the end of 2025, the installed desalination portfolio still included approximately 427 million imperial gallons per day of multi-stage flash capacity at Jebel Ali. That specific number is critical to understand. It proves that the old thermal machine is absolutely huge and still functioning exactly as designed. Dubai successfully engineered its way out of a severe natural limitation. But producing hundreds of millions of gallons of water this way creates an entirely new baseline for the city. It forces a completely different question. What does it actually cost to keep making water this way? The sea may contain essentially endless quantities of water, But separating pure freshwater from dissolved salt on a municipal scale requires serious industrial infrastructure. The primary consequence of multi-stage flash distillation is energy. This process is incredibly energy-intensive because it fundamentally relies on creating and sustaining massive amounts of heat. To make the water boil and flash into vapor, the desalination plants had to be deeply coupled with power generation facilities. The waste heat from electricity generation was used to drive the thermal water production. This meant the water system and the energy system were completely locked together. If the power plant slows down, the thermal water production is immediately affected. The secondary consequence is what happens to the salt. When you remove millions of gallons of pure freshwater from the sea, a much more concentrated saline reject stream remains. This byproduct is called brine. Desalination discharge can create important localized salinity and environmental effects near the outfall areas where it flows back into the sea. The natural circulation of the Arabian Gulf makes the basin-wide picture complicated. But the core reality remains very simple. The engineering solution does not make the salt magically disappear. It simply separates it and returns a heavier concentration back to the source. Dubai cannot simply stop desalinating water. The entire city absolutely depends on that daily continuous production to survive. But the heavy energy requirement of the thermal machine created a strong incentive to find a different path forward. So what happens if the city changes the machine? The alternative approach changes the fundamental mechanism of the water machine. Instead of using heat, the new capacity relies on pressure. This technology is known as seawater reverse osmosis. The basic flow inside one of these plants looks like this. The facility takes in raw seawater and pushes it through an extensive pre-treatment process to remove suspended solids and organic matter. Then, massive high-pressure pumps force that pre-treated water directly against specialized membranes. The physical pressure must be strong enough to overcome the natural osmotic pressure of the seawater. The microscopic pores in those membranes allow the freshwater molecules to pass through while blocking the dissolved salts and minerals. The result is fresh drinking water on one side and a concentrated reject stream on the other. The main advantage of reverse osmosis is that it requires significantly less energy than the traditional multi-stage flash process. Therefore, Dubai has a very strong reason to utilize seawater reverse osmosis for increasing amounts of new capacity. But less energy does not mean no energy. This is still heavy industrial engineering. A reverse osmosis plant still requires massive seawater intake structures. It requires precise chemical pretreatment, relentless high-pressure pumps, thousands of sensitive membranes, and complex energy recovery systems. Dubai is not replacing a complicated machine with a simple one. It is changing the specific kind of complexity it depends on, and the city is no longer just testing this pressure technology at a small scale. It is building entirely new monuments to water production. Look at the Hassyan Seawater Reverse Osmosis project. This facility represents a massive structural shift in how Dubai manufactures its drinking water. The project was designed for an ultimate capacity of approximately 180 million imperial gallons per day, and it required a capital investment of roughly 3.377 billion dirhams. This is not simply a future rendering or a distant proposal on a whiteboard. In the first quarter of 2026, the first major phase of Hassyan successfully brought approximately 60 million imperial gallons of daily capacity online. That immediately pushed the total installed desalination capacity of the city to approximately 555 million imperial gallons per day. By that point, reverse osmosis represented roughly 23% of the entire water production mix. and the Water Authority expected an additional 120 million gallons of reverse osmosis capacity to come online throughout the rest of 2026. Hassyan is not Dubai, experimenting with the pressure machine. It is Dubai, aggressively scaling it up to an absolute mega project level. The city successfully took a highly energy-intensive thermal system and began shifting new expansion toward a significantly lower energy alternative. It built a more efficient machine, and it proved that this new membrane technology could operate at the enormous scale required by a major global metropolis. So if you step back and look at the engineering achievement, the logical conclusion seems very clear. Dubai faced a strict natural freshwater limitation. Desalination solved the basic supply problem, and reverse osmosis solved the heavy energy constraint of the older thermal plants. So is the water problem finally solved? The answer is no, because solving the immediate physical constraints of water production did not freeze the city in place. The success of the engineered water machine actually enabled the exact opposite. It allowed the city to keep expanding. Whenever you look at a massive piece of infrastructure like the Hassyan plant, it is easy to focus only on the industrial machinery. But that machinery is intimately tied to what happens on the other end of the pipe. Every new residential neighborhood requires water. Every new commercial tower requires water. Every expanding business district, hotel development, and piece of civic infrastructure adds to the daily baseline. The successful engineering solution did not cap the need for fresh water. It simply provided the foundation for normal urban life to grow even larger. This creates an undeniable system relationship between urban growth and heavy industrial water production. More economic activity naturally increases the total demand for municipal water, and a larger, more reliable water infrastructure enables that expanding urban activity to function normally in the first place. This is not a simple story about desalination miraculously creating population growth out of thin air. It is a story about municipal demand relentlessly chasing the engineered solution. You can see this pressure clearly in the operational data. In 2024, Dubai recorded a peak daily desalinated water demand of approximately 455 million imperial gallons. Just 1 year later, in 2025, that peak daily demand climbed to roughly 487 million imperial gallons. That represents a year-on-year peak demand increase of more than 6.6%, and it means the entire system had to figure out how to manufacture roughly 32 million additional gallons of water every single day just to cover 1 year of growth. When demand rises that quickly across a major city, building a massive new reverse osmosis plant is not a luxury. It is an absolute operational necessity. The machine must continuously expand just to maintain the current standard of living and support commercial activity. Every time the city builds a new residential development, the water network must absorb that additional load. Every time a new business district opens, the daily water requirement increases. This forms a perpetual feedback loop. The more the city grows, the more water capacity it strictly requires. And the more capacity it builds, the more the city can continue to expand its footprint. Which leads to a very uncomfortable question. If normal urban life is completely dependent on this continuous industrial expansion, how large does the water machine eventually have to become? At this point, many people look at the efficiency of reverse osmosis and make a very logical assumption. They assume the old thermal plants are simply being shut down, dismantled, and completely replaced. They assume the new membrane technology has entirely won the future. But that assumption is completely wrong. The older thermal technology is not disappearing anytime soon. If you look at the end of 2025, the combined capacity of the Jebel Ali and Palm Jumeirah reverse osmosis plants was only about 68 million imperial gallons per day. Meanwhile, the heavy multi-stage flash thermal plants were still churning out approximately 427 million imperial gallons per day. The old machine is still doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting for the entire city, and the future blueprint confirms that this is not an overnight replacement story. The official published plan for 2030 targets a massive total desalination capacity of approximately 735 million imperial gallons per day. Out of that enormous total, only about 308 million gallons will come from seawater reverse osmosis using renewable energy. This is an extremely important reversal to understand. Dubai is not simply swapping one giant water machine for another. It is building a much larger, more complex water ecosystem around both the old heat process and the new pressure process. When you look at this expanding ecosystem, a central realization emerges. Dubai's water story cannot be fully understood separately from its energy story. The system is not simply a pipe pulling pure water directly from the sea. The true architecture of normal urban water is actually a massive interconnected equation. It requires raw seawater, plus continuous power generation, heavy industrial machinery, strategic storage, and a vast distribution network to deliver normal urban water. For decades, the water supply was fundamentally tied to the thermal waste heat of traditional electricity generation. By shifting a significant portion of its new capacity towards seawater reverse osmosis, Dubai is doing something very strategic. It is lowering the total energy requirement for future water expansion, and it is making new water production far less tightly coupled to traditional thermal power plants. This technological decoupling allows the city to build massive standalone water facilities that can eventually be powered by renewable energy. But even with better mechanical efficiency, the entire ecosystem still relies on continuous, uninterrupted industrial operation. The thousands of high-pressure pumps must keep spinning. The reverse osmosis membranes must keep filtering. The older thermal stages must keep flashing heated seawater into vapor, because the growing metropolis on the other side of the network never stops consuming. If continuous production has become this critical to the daily survival of the city, a very serious vulnerability remains. What happens when that continuous daily production cannot simply be assumed? Dubai understands that water production is far too important to rely solely on machinery operating without a safety net. So the city engineered a third solution to build a massive buffer around the plants. One of the primary layers of this resilience strategy is known as aquifer storage and recovery. The concept is essentially a strategic underground reserve. The system takes excess freshwater produced by the desalination plants and injects it deep into local underground aquifers. It stores that pure water securely beneath the surface, where it can be protected from evaporation. This specific aquifer storage project has been designed with the potential to hold up to 6 billion imperial gallons of strategic freshwater. During a severe emergency or an unexpected disruption in normal production, the city can retrieve that water. The system is capable of pumping out more than 50 million imperial gallons of water every single day for roughly 90 days. And this underground reserve is just one layer of a much broader water resilience infrastructure. The city also maintains massive conventional surface reservoirs and interconnected network storage. This is a highly effective, real-world engineering solution. It guarantees that the city has a structural cushion to survive a disruption. But creating a massive strategic reserve does not actually remove the underlying physical dependency. It simply provides a buffer. This brings us to the true climax of Dubai's water infrastructure story. It is not about the concentrated brine left behind in the Arabian Gulf. And it is not about the exact ratio of older thermal plants to newer reverse osmosis membranes. The true final problem is absolute, fundamental dependency. If you reconstruct this entire historical arc, a fascinating and complex reality emerges. Dubai began its modern era with severely limited natural freshwater resources. The heavy industrial engineering of seawater desalination completely solved that initial physical constraint. That highly reliable engineered water then became the rock-solid foundation for modern urban life. The city capitalized on that success and simply continued expanding its physical and economic footprint. As the urban environment expanded, the baseline water demand relentlessly increased. To keep up with that rising demand, Dubai began adopting more efficient pressure-driven technology. It built larger capacity megaprojects like Hassyan to handle the load. It developed strategic underground aquifer reserves to protect that massive capacity. And as a direct result of all that highly successful engineering, even more of normal Dubai now simply assumes that hundreds of millions of gallons of fresh water will always be available. The natural freshwater scarcity of the region did not magically disappear. Dubai simply engineered an enormous shield around it. And over decades of continuous growth, that engineered shield became entirely indispensable. But this reality should not be framed as proof that the city is somehow doomed to an imminent collapse. Is absolute dependence on heavy infrastructure necessarily a fatal weakness? Every modern global city is already completely dependent on highly complex invisible systems. Major metropolitan hubs depend on continuous electricity grids, global communications networks, transport logistics, and vast agricultural supply chains. Engineered freshwater is simply another critical industrial system that Dubai has successfully made completely essential to its daily survival. But it creates an extraordinary, almost beautiful paradox. The machine did not fail to solve Dubai's water problem. It solved it so extraordinarily well that the entire city grew into the solution. Throughout this story, we have looked at massive industrial infrastructure. We have seen the boiling steam of thermal desalination and the relentless high-pressure pumps of reverse osmosis. We have seen the enormous capacity of Hassyan and billions of gallons of strategic aquifer storage. But the true scale of this achievement is best understood by looking at the smallest possible component: one single, ordinary tap. When a person in Dubai turns on a tap, they do not see the heavy industry. They only see clean, flowing water. The extraordinary thing about Dubai's massive desalination network is not merely that it manufactures fresh water from the sea. It is that almost everyone using that water is allowed to completely forget that the machine even exists. But the easier that water feels at the tap, the more complicated the invisible system behind that tap has actually become. Dubai engineered its way around a fundamental freshwater scarcity. The modern city then grew entirely around that incredible engineering. So how big does the machine have to become next? And as the city increasingly relies on filtering its future, what happens if the surrounding seawater becomes too difficult for the new machine to process? This video is for educational and analytical purposes, based on available data and engineering principles. It does not represent an official assessment of Dubai municipal infrastructure or replace professional environmental analysis. If you want to understand the invisible systems that keep modern cities running, make sure to subscribe. What infrastructure topic should we investigate next? Let us know in the comments.